and gentlemen, my name is Bob Bernier, and I'm an aircraft restoration volunteer at the San Diego Air and Space Museum down in Balboa Park. And today I'm going to be talking about the USS Langley, America's first aircraft carrier. Of course, I'll be talking about that, but also I want to talk about the remarkable men that got the Langley built and operational a century ago. While I'm at it, I'd like to mention that San Diego, in some circles, is known as the birthplace of naval aviation. And that is because back in 1911, Glenn Curtiss himself trained the Navy's first aviator at what is now known as Navy North Island Naval Air Station. And not only that, beginning in 1924, with the Langley being home ported in San Diego, aircraft carriers have been part of the San Diego scene ever since then. All right. Langley, when it first came out, was an experiment to see if the Navy could operate aircraft carriers at sea and also the aircraft off the aircraft carriers. They wanted to see if they could launch the airplanes and also recover the aircraft safely. Langley is an ugly duckling of a ship. It was a converted coal carrier, Collier, and it was for one purpose only, to test the concept of operating aircraft at sea. 468 crew members on board, 3 boilers. It could move along at about 15.5 knots or 17 miles an hour. Initially carried about 8, maybe 12 airplanes. And then in the lower right-hand corner, what you see down there is the latest carrier in the U.S. Navy. It's called the Gerald R. Ford. Nuclear powered, 2 nuclear reactors, over 1,000 feet long, 30 plus knots, can carry up to 90 airplanes. It's the very latest aircraft carrier in the fleet. So, First World War, proving ground for naval aviation. The British and the American Navy experimented with airplanes at sea. The Navy, U.S. Navy, was flying mostly anti-submarine patrols with flying boats. The British, however, had to get land planes out to sea. And the reason was because of the German Zeppelins. The Zeppelins were harassing the British fleet in the North Sea. Reconnaissance runs, long-range reconnaissance runs. Also, the Zeppelins were bombing England at nighttime. And the float planes that both navies had at the time didn't have the performance to get up to the altitudes that the Zeppelins operated at. So they had to figure out a way to get land planes out to sea. And the Royal Navy experimented with wooden launch platforms affixed to gun turrets on these light cruisers. They had about 22 light cruisers with these wooden platforms. And you can see that on the left-hand side. It's a very small platform, and they would launch these scout planes. At the time, that was known as a pursuit plane or a fighter plane. And the idea was to launch these airplanes, soft with pop camels, and they would go up and attack the Zeppelins. So they experimented with 22 Royal Navy cruisers with these wooden launch platforms. And at the end of the mission, if the pilot could, he would land ashore. But most of the time, they would have to just basically ditch behind the ship they launched off. And you can see on the right-hand side what that looked like. All right, this was the enemy. This was the problem. That's why they had to figure out a way to get land planes out to sea. And the land planes had the performance to get up and reach the Zeppelins. And that's why they were trying to do that. The Zeppelins were tracking the fleet movements of the Royal Navy out in the North Sea. And also, as I mentioned, flying from Germany, they were attacking Great Britain at night, nighttime raids. So August 1921, 1917, the Royal Navy launches a Sopwith Pup from HMS Yarmouth, there on the left-hand side. And it attacked a Zeppelin L-23, which was operating off the Danish coast, tracking the Royal Navy. It managed to shoot it down after 2 passes. And this was the first recorded ship-launched aircraft that achieved an air victory in history. And let's move on. All right. Just a bit later, another year later, there was still being plagued by the Zeppelins, and the Royal Navy was trying to figure out a way to hit back. Now, the British land planes didn't have the range to reach these Zeppelin bases in Germany. So the Royal Navy came up and they converted a battlecruiser, the HMS Furious, which was originally built to carry these enormous guns, these 18-inch guns. Initially, when they converted this ship, they put a flying off platform on the front, as you can see down there. And they would launch the airplanes off that flying off platform, and the airplanes would go out, do their mission, come back, and either ditch along the ship or try to find a base along shore. And that was costly in airplanes and pilots. So they decided, well, let's see if we can land airplanes on the stern of the ship. They put another platform, as you can see, on the ship. The problem was when the planes came in, any aviators here could see that you would get this turbulence off the superstructure of the ship plus the stack gases. So this didn't really work out. Still, Royal Navy had to do something, so they sent a small fleet of warships. They sailed within 70 miles of Germany, off the German coast, North Sea coast, and they launched 7 with Camels. And these Camels were launched with 250-pound bombs apiece. And they attacked at dawn, the Zeppelin sheds at Torndern airship base. And they caught the Germans completely by surprise. The Germans thought that they were way beyond the reach of any British aircraft. They destroyed 2 airships. That's the first known airstrike from a carrier in history. All right. Now, during World War I, the British, of course, had allies, France, America, and Japan. And there were naval observers from America and Japan working with the British fleet, and they noticed all these achievements that the Royal Navy was doing, and they began experimenting with what they called airplane carrier ships soon after the war. Now, the qualifier there was that they must be able to launch and recover these aircraft, and in America's case, that airplane carrier ship was what you see right below you, depicted. That was the Langley. And the British and the Japanese Navy had ships that looked very similar to this. The British ship was called the HMS Argus, and the Japanese had one very similar looking, and they're all experimenting, trying to figure out how to launch aircraft and recover these aircraft safely. So post-World War I, budgets were tight. There was fierce competition between the Army and the Navy for aviation assets, plus controlling the funding. The Navy considered airplanes essential for battleship admirals, considered them essential for scouting and maybe spotting the fall of shot from battleships, but only in a supporting role. And the senior brass always thought they'd be subordinate to battleships. However, Naval Aviator Number 16, Commander Kenneth Whiting, and other forward-thinking naval officers had different ideas. They thought we should be embracing the advanced technologies that aircraft offered, and they thought perhaps that airplanes could be developed into an offensive weapon. And they believed ship-based aircraft would prove useful. So they started experimenting once again. Now you see Whiting on a Wright Flyer on the left-hand side, and he has a distinction of being the last naval aviator trained by the Wright brothers. He was a man of adventure. He was a young submarine officer in the Philippines. We'll talk about that here shortly. So 1909, Commander Kenneth Whiting, at the time he was a lieutenant, he's in charge or command of a submarine called the USS Porpoise, and he was based in the Philippines in Manila Bay. He achieved something that no one else had achieved before. He became the first individual to leave a submarine while it was submerged, and he did it by going through the torpedo tube. He believed that a submarine crew could rescue themselves or save themselves if the submarine went down by just getting out the torpedo tube and crawling through that and getting to the surface. So the submarine went out to sea. Whiting's in command. He tells his crew chief on the submarine that, we're going to do something different today. I'm going to exit the submarine to prove that it can be done. You're going to come up on the surface and get me when I'm done with this thing. So he climbs into the torpedo tube. You can see a photo right down there. That's not him, actually, but that's what they did later. And they close the torpedo hatches behind him, open the outer torpedo doors, and he crawls through that torpedo tube. It's an 18-inch torpedo tube. And he manages to get out of that thing and get to the surface. It took him 77 seconds. Submarine comes up. He climbs on board, said, hey, that was a piece of cake. It was easy. Pretty impressive what he did. He really impressed the superior officers. He was the first one to leave a submerged submarine through a torpedo tube. All right. He was one of the first to join the Naval Aviation Branch. And as mentioned earlier, last aviator trained by Orville Wright. And his association with a ship called the USS Jupiter, which was a Collier launch in 1913, started with World War I. Whiting was a commander of the first aviation unit to set foot in France, U.S. Navy aviation unit to set in France. And during World War I, the Jupiter, mostly was involved with hauling coal from ship to ship, refueling them at sea or in port. But they did other duties as well. And one of those duties was transporting personnel and cargo over to Europe. And Whiting's unit was transferred over to Europe aboard the Jupiter. And as he's on board this ship, he's looking around, he's noticing that it has huge cargo holes. And he's thinking ahead. He's thinking, if this was an airplane carrier, we could store these airplanes. These holes are very spacious. It's one of the few ships in the Navy could do that. This has possibilities. So he just takes notes of that. He notes the large cargo holes, large enough to accommodate aircraft. So he's thinking ahead. And this is the USS Jupiter, 1917. By the way, it was launched in 1913 out of Mirror Island Naval Shipyard. The first captain was a gentleman known as Bull Reeves, Captain Bull Reeves, and we'll hear about him later. So March 1919, doing a general board meeting, Whiting is there, and he has a lot of respect from the Navy admirals because he was an outstanding athlete at the Naval Academy, plus his exploits as a submarine commander, and he did a bang-up job doing World War I with the Navy Aviation Group over in France. So the Naval Board, General Board 1919, for the 1920 budget, Whiting advocated converting a ship for operating aircraft at sea. And what he had in mind was a ship like the Jupiter, the one he made the transatlantic crossing back in 1917 or so. Okay, here's a USS Jupiter in collier configuration. You notice all those tall derricks that you see midsection. Those were for transferring coal from one ship to the other. And you notice there's not much superstructure. All right. So they get approval. Congress approves the funds, 1919, and they start conversion in 1920. Jupiter entered Norfolk Navy Shipyard for conversion, and you can see the start of the operation right there. So the first thing they did is they cleared out all those derricks. They kept the basis of the derricks, and from there, what they did is they built the lattice support structure for the flight deck, and you can see it in that photo, the beginnings of that structure to support the flight deck. On the spot adaptation. Well, the reason I'm saying that is because when this ship came into the shipyard, this is the first aircraft carrier for the U.S. Navy. And people really didn't have an idea what to do. All the shipyard workers knew was the aviators needing a long flying off platform on the top. Everything else below that, they had to figure out what to do. It was a good choice for a ship because it had very large cargo holes that could be reconfigured into aircraft hangars and workshops. For example, it had 6 cargo holes. This is what they used to store the coal. So the first cargo hold was used for storing aviation gasoline. The fourth one that's where they stored the elevator machinery. And the rest of the 4 holes that they were used for storing aircraft and workshops. Jupiter was not ideal because of her slow speed. She could do 17 miles an hour or 15 and a half knots on a very good day. Most battleships at the time, the battle fleet, they could attain speeds of 22 knots. So she wasn't ideal, but this ship was a test bed. It wasn't an experiment. The main deck, the original main deck of the Jupiter became the hangar deck. And you'll see better photos of that a little later. So everything below the flight deck had to be figured out. What are we going to do? How are we going to do all these things? So initially, the only guidance of shipyard personnel was we need a long open deck. A young pilot assigned to the Langley at the time, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Back in the early 1920s, when all this was taking place, the Navy had 314 pilots. Of those 314 pilots, very few were actually qualified to fly land planes. By that, I mean flying planes with wheels. Most Navy pilots were flying float planes or flying boats. The Navy did have a few land plane pilots, and these were based on battleship. They had 8 battleships with flying off decks built over turrets, and the idea was they would have these little Newport fighters, and they would launch to intercept enemy scout planes. And again, at the end of the mission, what they would do is either find a friendly base to land at. Most oftentimes, what they would do is ditch alongside a destroyer and be picked up out of the water, fished out of the water. So the Navy had 15 of these pilots, and they were called turret hoppers because the flight decks were built over the turrets of the ship. And they were led by a Navy officer named Chevy Chevalier. He's quite a character, Naval Academy graduate, Naval Aviator number 7, I believe. And we'll talk a bit about him. And he was a good friend of Whiting as well. So a lot of design was on-the-spot adaptation. One of those early pilots, one of the 15, was Jack Tate. And I want to mention right now that all these original Langley pilots, a lot of them made admiral. They were very intrepid, innovative young men, and they had a pretty good future in the Navy. So here's a good view of the Langley right now. You can see below the flight deck, that flat area is the main deck. That's where they call it the hangar deck. The ship itself was 64 feet in beam, the flight deck, and with 534 feet long was the flight deck was 534 feet long. Whatever went on below was an afterthought. By that, I mean, when they were building the ship, you can see that it would be top heavy with all that flight deck way above there. That flight deck, by the way, was 30 feet above the main deck. So in order to give it enough ballast, what they did on those cargo holes before they put in the workshops and the hangars and all that sort of thing, what they did was they poured in 10 feet of concrete into the bottom of those cargo holes to give the ship enough ballast so it would be stable at sea with all that weight on top. So here's the hangar deck right here. It's 30 feet below the flight deck. And you can see at the top of the photo, if you look closely, there's a traveling crane, and that crane would move around back and forth and it would pull airplanes out of the cargo hold. Now, they didn't have enough space. So when they had these airplanes on board, they would actually store them disassembled down in the cargo holds. When they needed an airplane, that crane would go up, pull the plane out of the cargo hold, and they would assemble it on the hangar bay. And you can see one of the airplanes in the foreground there without the wings. So they would assemble those airplanes, and that traveling crane would shuttle the airplanes back and forth, and then it would take it to an elevator, and onto the elevator, it would go up to the flight deck. Kind of a cumbersome process. It took quite a while to get an airplane ready for flight. So I was talking about that elevator, and you can see it in a down position right there, and you can see the traveling crane, the hook from the crane up overhead. So the process was they would pull an airplane out of that cargo hold, bring it up on the hangar deck, assemble it, and now they still have a problem because you can see that elevator, it's in the lowest position it will go. It's still 8 feet off the hangar deck. So they have to figure out a way to get it from the main deck or hangar deck onto the elevator, and they would do that with a series of ramps. You can see those soar horses and those ramps right there. They'd roll it up there and get it onto the elevator, and then they would take it up to the flight deck. And that whole process could take quite a while, as you can imagine. Okay, so I mentioned that the Langley was an experiment to see if the Navy could launch aircraft and recover the aircraft. Now, if that experiment didn't turn out, they were hedging their bets. And the idea was if it didn't work out as an airplane carrier with land airplanes, they would use it as a seaplane tender. So the Langley had 2 cranes on either side of the hangar deck so they could operate seaplanes. They would land the seaplanes alongside in the water, use these cranes to hoist them up onto the hangar deck. So they bring them up on the deck, and this is way back in the early 1920s, which I find amazing. They would launch them with a compressed air catapult. And the way they would do this is they would have a dolly that the float plane would sit on, and they would attach the dolly, a wheeled dolly, to the catapult, and they would shoot out the catapult. Of course, the airplane would be running at full power, and off they would go. The dolly would stay behind. The airplane would lift off with its floats into the air. So, not to interfere with flight ops, smokestacks could be pivoted to a horizontal position. And you can see them right there. Normally in the vertical position when the ship is underway. However, doing flight operations, they would go to the horizontal. That's so that the pilots wouldn't have to contend with the stack gases coming out. And they also had retractable flag masts. And you'll see a little video about that a little later. And then, of course, I want to point out right at the very stern, you see that little structure there that looks like a little house beneath the flight deck on the main deck, and that's called the pigeon loft. And we'll talk about that a little later. They named the ship, the Navy's first aircraft carrier, CB-1, was named after Samuel Pierpont Langley. He was a professor at the Naval Academy, celebrated aviation pioneer. He experimented with launching aircraft off barges in the Potomac River. He was actually trying to develop a steam-powered airplane. He was also the third secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. So the Navy named this first ship after Langley. And of course, the Wright brothers were not too happy with that. There was a lot of competition between the Wright brothers, Glenn Curtiss, and Samuel Langley concerning aviation. All right, with the commissioning, Commander Whiting, now the ship's executive officer, was determined to prove the ship's value to the fleet. And she became a technology demonstrator, a floating test bed designed to develop new techniques to launch and recover aircraft. Also, more importantly, she was training the first generation of naval aviators and flight deck crew on how to do all this. More adaptation. Well, the Navy, as I mentioned, they had mostly float planes. So the first airplanes they had were float planes were converted to become land airplanes. They had to reinforce the landing gear, and they had to figure out a way to stop these airplanes. So they came up with an idea to use trailing hooks or tail hooks, and another system they adopted from the British, which was these axle hooks on between the wheels. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. First aviators, initial cadre, 15 aviators. They practiced spot landings ashore. They had an outline of the ship painted on their practice field, and they practiced spot landings. And then they had a barge, and this Mel Pride did all this. They had a barge on the Potomac with a wooden platform on it, and they would practice doing touch and goes onto that wooden platform. Touch down, take off again. So Lieutenant Alfred Mel Pride, here he is right here. He later became an admiral as well. He was assigned a task of coming up with a workable system to stop aircraft on the flight deck. It's called the resting gear. And initially they tried two different systems. They adopted one system for the British. It's called fore and aft gear, parallel wires running forward, converging towards the front end on the aft 200 feet of the ship. And these anchor-shaped hooks between the axles of the airplane would engage those parallel wires that were about 10 inches off the flight deck. And that friction was thought to bring them to a halt slowly. You'll see a photo of that here lately. Let's get to that right now. There we go. So if you look at this photo, you can see between the wheels of the airplane, the axle, beneath it, you have these anchor-shaped hooks. So these wires, these fore and aft wires are 10 inches off the deck, and they'll touch down. These anchor hooks will engage them, and that friction supposedly will stop the airplane. It kind of worked. It had the advantage of keeping the airplane aligned going down the flight deck, because these airplanes had no brakes, and they had no power steering, of course, so that would keep them aligned going down the runway. And also, if there was a gust of wind, these airplanes were very lightweight. If there was a gust of wind, they'd keep them planted to the deck. The problem was there was a lot of resistance or friction produced by these anchor hooks, and sometimes the airplanes would nose over and catch the prop. So no one knew much about a resting gear, recalled Pride. I'll read this part. And he had no idea why he picked me, one of his pilots to design the landing gear for the USS Langley. Well, the reason he was picked is because he was a brilliant engineer from MIT. That's why Chevy Chevalier picked him. So he's talking about Chevy Chevalier. Now, he walked up to me one summer day in 1921, told me to stay ashore at Norfolk and begin work. I said, aye, aye, sir, and that was it. So we had to come up with a way to stop these aircraft once they touched down. So they tried two different methods. They tried this method here, the longitudinal wires, fore and after wires. And they also tried cross-deck pendants or cross-deck wires, which is still used today in the Navy. What was decided upon was 5 rows of cross-deck wires strung across the aft portion of the flight deck to engage your plane's trailing hook. And you can see that trailing hook right there. It's not really a tail hook. These airplanes were very flimsy, so what they would do is these are like metal straps, and they actually go forward to the engine mounts, the rear engine mounts, and they attach that. It was the strongest point on the airplane. want to point out a few things on this. You can see that trailing hook, and that's designed to engage the cross-deck pendants. And then you can see those axle hooks between the wheels, those anchor-shaped axle hooks. And that was designed to engage the longitudinal wires or the fore and aft wires. They were experimenting. They were seeing which system worked best. So they had two systems. And then that, ahead of the wheels, you see that kind of like triangular piece. That's called a hydro vane. And that was put there. If the airplane had to ditch at sea, it was hoped that that would prevent the airplane from flipping over on its back. So once the wires were hooked, the cross-deck wires, the retarding force was provided by a system of weights that was attached to a block and tackle system. That's how this airplane would be brought to a halt. One of the ways, anyway. Langley was also fitted with 4.5 wires. I talked about that. Arresting gear adopted from the British. They were joining wires on the aft flag deck conversions. They ran forward. Once engaged by the anchor-shaped axle blocks mounted between the plane's wheels, slowed the airplane down. It was not a very good system, caused the airplanes to nose over, and was eventually abandoned. And they came up with they used the cross-deck wires instead, better system. Now, as America's experimenting with the Langley, so are the British and the Japanese. Everybody's trying to figure out a way to launch these airplanes effectively and recover them. So Langley first set sail September 1922. And she went out to sea to test her launch and recovery gear. In other words, they had two different systems for arresting gears onto the flight deck, stopping airplanes on the flight deck. They wanted to see which worked best. And also the best way to conduct flight deck operations. So they finally launched an airplane off the flight deck, and it was flown by Lieutenant Commander Virgil Squash Griffin. He made the first takeoff from our flight deck 17 October 1922 in a biplane. And then 9 days later, this man, Lieutenant Commander Godfrey Chevy Chevalier, made the first landing aboard landing while she was underway. Both these gentlemen were Naval Academy graduates. The first landing was done off the Virginia Capes. The ship was doing about 6 knots. They had 30 miles an hour wind. And Chevy Chevalier landed at about 45 miles an hour. He got aboard safely, nicked the propeller, but they still considered that cause for celebration. He got the airplane stopped on the deck. That was a big deal. So we're going to look at a video right now.
So, in this somewhat skeptical atmosphere, the USS Langley CV-1 emerged. She was an experiment at first, a flight deck built on an obsolete collier's hull, an airport sent out to sea. Lieutenant Commander Chevalier made the first landing on the Langley deck in 1922. For the next few years, Navy pilots and the Langley crew worked hard to master the complex techniques for handling both the carrier and her planes. Way, but we learned to land on her deck. We also worked hard at learning to take off and at air navigation, gunfire spotting, and aerial gunnery. The early 1920s also saw the development of catapults, arresting gear, a faster elevator to clear the flight deck, safe fuel handling techniques, a landing light system, and all the other hardware needed to launch and land, to refuel and maintain aircraft at sea. All our early early work was complicated by the progress made in aircraft design from 1925 to 1930. Engines were increasingly bigger and more powerful. Planes got heavier and yet flew higher, farther, faster almost every day.
Okay. And we saw in the early part of that film clip a lot of crashes, airplanes getting banged up and such, wheels falling off. And, back in the day, they came up with the term, any landing you could walk away from was a good landing. And they truly believed that. They had a lot of smash ups when they first started, but they got better as they went along. They learned as they flew these airplanes. So while Langley was undergoing conversion, something very important happened in naval aviation, got a big boost in September 1921. The Navy established the Bureau of Aeronautics, and that was to promote naval aviation within the Navy and before Congress. And it was headed by Rear Admiral William Moffett, very dynamic leader. And his job was to promote naval aviation development to Congress and to the Navy. He used to testify before Congress, and one congressman called Moffat's testimony on Capitol Hill a masterpiece. He's very, very politically savvy. And good thing, too, because at the time, General Billy Mitchell was advocating for bomber squadrons to take over the role of the Navy. Early in 1921, Billy Mitchell did an exercise where his bombers attacked a group of stationary warships off the Virginia Capes. These were captured German warships from World War I and surplus U.S. Navy warships. And they managed to sink a number of these vessels. And with that, Billy Mitchell advocated for basically America could be more cheaply defended by squadrons of Army bombers. And did we really need a Navy with expensive warships? So this got the Navy's attention. And the Navy wanted newer and bigger aircraft carriers. And so they got to work doing that. What the Navy really wanted was funding for bigger carriers fast enough to keep up and support the battle fleet. And it should be emphasized that the Langley itself was just an experiment, proof of concept test vehicle, and to be used while the planners were trying to figure out how to make a full-fledged warship out of an aircraft carrier. And Langley served that purpose well. So Moffat's efforts were successful. In July 1922, Congress authorized 2 aircraft carriers, money for these aircraft carriers, and they were to be converted out of 2 battle cruisers that were being built, the USS Lexington, CV-2, and Saratoga, CV-3. Their initially were supposed to be battle cruisers. They used their hulls and machinery within the hulls and basically redesigned them as aircraft carriers. These ships were amazing ships, actually. They were very fast, 33 knots, heavily armed, and they played a significant role in the early days of World War II. Tactical doctrine, equipment, and flight procedures were all pioneered by the Langley and transferred to these ships. This is an envelope from a friend of mine, stamp collector. The Langley, with its wooden flight deck high above the main deck, to the sailors looked like an old covered wagon, ugly duckling of a ship. One officer called it this comic ship. So after joining the fleet in 1923, the Langley toured the East Coast and sailed up the Potomac River, starting her marvels of naval aviation. So she toured the East Coast basically on a PR tour for naval aviation, got as far as Bar Harbor, Maine. And 1923, now the conversion of these 2 battle cruisers into aircraft carriers is underway, but Admiral Moffett, he senses a wavering in commitment to get these ships completed as aircraft carriers because it's a very expensive thing to do. So he decides to have the Langley come up the Potomac River to Washington, D.C., called it the Covered Wagon Tours. Let's go into that. So Moffett, savvy political player, sensed the wavering support. In June 1923, he gets Langley come up to Washington. and she docks at the Washington Navy Yard. At the time, she was the largest warship ever to go up the Potomac. And the public was invited on board, politicians, movers and shakers, and they got to watch these airplanes landing and taking off from the Langley. And it was quite the novelty back in those days. Even President Warren Harding showed up, and he was quite impressed, and he affirmed his support for continued funding of those two battle cruisers and aircraft carriers. So Admiral Moffett did his job, and he was honing his political skills as early as the days when Theodore Roosevelt was president. You can see him right here. So testing, everything was new. They did everything by trial and error. They were learning how to fly aircraft carriers. Various types of landing approaches were initially flown. Each pilot has his own technique for getting the airplane on the deck, but the best approaches were flown by Lieutenant Mel Pride, and he used a slow nose high power on turning approach. His technique was adopted as standard. Now, this type of approach was very difficult to see over the nose because you're flying on a nose high position. So what had to be done was, depending on the stature of the pilot, they were known as 2, 3, or even 4 cushion men, because in order to see over the nose, they would sit on these cushions. So some of these pilots were so short, they would sit on 4 cushions to get the airplane onto the deck so they could see over the nose. New set of commands came out. First heard on an aircraft carrier, the Langley: rig the deck, pilots man your aircraft, and stand by to start engines, being among them. Let's look at another video. Give me a shorter one. What you can see now is that telescopic mass going into the deck. So they're lowering the smokestacks. More landings. You'll see this one go up in its nose, I think. Let's see. Oh, maybe not. Oh, here we go. There we go. That's what those axle hooks would do on the nose gear. That's a trailing hook. All right. Langley came up with a number of different innovations. Actually, the man that came up with most of these innovations was Whiting. Really a remarkable man. While the Whiting was at sea and they were conducting flight operations, Whiting was the executive officer of the ship, and he would be on the stern. He'd be watching his pilots coming on in, and he'd get kind of anxious watching these guys coming in because they may not be doing something right. They may be too low, maybe too high, too fast, too slow, whatever it was. And he would be making gestures with his hands and arms, his body English, basically, for the corrections these pilots needed to do. And unknowingly, he was making these hand signals. Didn't realize what he was doing. What he didn't realize also is the pilots was observing his body English, and pilots got together later and they decided, hey, an experienced man coaching our approaches would be a good idea. So that's when they came up with the idea of a landing signalman was born. That was another Langley innovation way back in the early 1920s. Some ideas, however, just didn't fly, and one of them was the pigeon house on Langley's fan tile. Back in the early days, when the Langley was first built, let's go back to World War I, to communicate, the Navy flying boats, when they were flying their anti-submarine patrols off the coast of France and England, to communicate, they were using carrier pigeons. They would carry a crate of these pigeons in, and they would send a message back to their base with a carrier pigeon. Radios back in those days were very primitive. Pilots back in the early 1920s, whether they were Army or Navy pilot, before they went on a cross-country flight, they would check into the base operations, check in with the pigeon quartermaster, and check out a crate of homing pigeons to be used in case of emergency. So if the airplane went down, and they did quite a bit back then, engine problems, and the engines weren't that reliable, it would come down in a farmer's field or whatever, and they could send a message back to the base via carrier pigeon, giving them a rough idea where they were. So on board the Langley, they decided that was the way they were going to communicate. They had the pigeons aloft on the stern of the ship, and they attempted to train these pigeons to carry messages. And they went out to sea one day, and they had a pigeon quartermaster on board. And he decided that the pigeons needed exercise, so they launched all the pigeons, and they flew around the ship 3 times and promptly headed back to Norfolk, Virginia, where the Langley was basically in dry dock to be converted into an aircraft carrier. Get a message back from Norfolk saying, please come get your pigeons. We don't want them anymore. So as Admiral Tate said, the attempt to train the pigeons to return to the ship was a great failure, but provided an excellent supply of squab for the mess. Pigeons were evicted, and Langley's pigeon coop became the XO's quarters, or the executive officer's quarters. That's why that XO, when he first checked aboard, decided that he described the Langley as this poor comic ship. I don't know if he had to change out or clean out the pigeon coop or not, but he moved in. All right, here's a pigeon coop right here on the left-hand side, circled. And then on the right-hand side, sailors love to tell sea stories. And here's a couple of Langley pigeons telling their sea stories. Okay, at first, Langley had no assigned squadron. She was used strictly as an experimental platform, trying to develop the techniques to efficiently launch and recover aircraft. Important tasks of training the Navy's first generation of carrier pilots and deck crews. And this is an article that came out of All Flying Navy, published in 1944. The learning curve was steep. You saw that in those films, all those banged up airplanes. Instrument face was a distinguishing mark of Langley's pilots, who loosened teeth and flattened noses against their instrument panels while negotiating the hazards of landing on the Langley's small flight deck and its crude resting gear. Planes went overboard, piled up in the crash barriers, stood on their noses, and came apart. But the science of carrier operations was developed as a monument to these pilots' perseverance. And years later, they would call, they'd have what they would call the Langley nose, a flat nose, like a boxer's nose, or the instrument face. And that was bragging rights in the old clubs when these guys would get together. It became a big deal to be one of the original Langley pilots. And here's pilots trying to join the Langley Instrument Face Club. You can see all these different banged up airplanes, but these were considered good landings. If they got on board and managed to walk away, that was considered a good landing. Any landing you could walk away from. So here we are, November 1924, the Langley joined the Pacific Battle Fleet in San Diego. That's where the history started for the San Diego home porting of aircraft carriers. And the first Navy squadron to be based aboard an aircraft carrier was VF-2. And they had these first fighter squadron, they had these very primitive Vought VE-7S biplanes assigned to a Navy carrier, first fighter squadron assigned to a Navy carrier. And these airplanes, well, I'll talk a little bit more about the Vought in a minute. So first battle fleet exercise was in March 1925, and the Langley was assigned to one fleet. They had a blue fleet and a red fleet, and the fleet with the Langley did much better than the opposing fleet without aircraft support. And the admirals noticed this, and they were soon banging tables saying, hey, we need to get the Saratoga and Lexington to the fleet right away. We need these ships. So the accelerated completion of both Lexington and Saratoga, plus the admiral in charge decided that they're going to build purpose-built carrier planes as well, ships specifically designed for aircraft carrier use. And along comes this man. This is later Admiral, but Captain Joseph Bull Reeves, the force multiplier. Early 1920s, Captain Reeves headed the tactics department at the Naval War College. And he was primarily interested in developing tactics to use airplanes as offensive weapons. And he became a big innovator in carrier tactical doctrine. Vision aircraft as offensive weapons, and he was tasked with formulating effective carrier tactics. Comes on board the Langley. He was aircraft squadron commander, battle fleet, and basically Commodore. And he observed operations aboard Langley for 1 month. And then he said about introducing changes. At the time that he came aboard, the Langley would carry maybe 8 to 12 airplanes. And the officers at the time thought that this was the maximum number of airplanes that the Langley could safely operate. Captain Reeves thought that this would not do. The Langley would never become an effective warship if they continued what they were doing. So he set about introducing changes. He was known as Bull Reeves because a Naval Academy football player. Reeves reasoned the carrier force would have more offensive punch with more airplanes. So he started experimenting. First, they put on 12 airplanes, and they got it up to, eventually they got it up to 36 airplanes. Some say 42, depending on what material you read. The Langley officers didn't think that they could safely operate these airplanes, but Reeves pushed through these changes, eventually increasing the number of embarked aircraft up to 42. And he set about dramatically increasing the efficiency of flight deck operations by continuously drilling the flight deck crew to launch and recover aircraft. And we'll talk about how he did that. So under his leadership, officers on board the Langley decided that flight deck crewmen would have specific jobs. They would become experts at specific jobs. And they were issued colored jerseys, which identified them with which task they were going to do when an airplane was about to take off or landed. For example, the people in red that you see down there, they're ordnancemen. They handle the weapons that are loaded onto the airplane. The ones in green are the people that would work with the catapults or the arresting gear. And the gentlemen in yellow are the flight deck officers or flight deck directors. They would direct the airplanes around the flight deck. And also they develop a series of hand signals for communicating above the roar of these airplane engines. All hand signals above the waist were for pilots. Those below the waist were for flight deck crew. And they had to do this because you could have up to 30 airplanes turning their engines and no one could hear a thing. So they came up with these hand signals. And that was developed way back in the 1920s. Some of those hand signals are still used today. So a lot of innovation way back when. So what Reeves noticed about these carrier operations, and the British and the Japanese were doing the same thing. The Langley would have an airplane come in for a landing. And in order to clear the deck, what they would do is they would load that airplane on the elevator and take it below deck before the next airplane would land. So that evolution could take up to 12 minutes to get it down off the flight deck, below deck. It was too time consuming if the Langley was become an effective fighting ship. So Reeves came up with a key innovation. That's what he's best remembered for, is speeding up the landing and takeoff cycle. So we'll talk about how he did that. So he realized the combat potential was directly related to the number of missions or sortie rates that a carrier could achieve. And under his command, Langley became a warship. Doing fleet exercises in Hawaii in 1928, Langley launched 35 aircraft in 7 minutes. During that same exercise, Langley planes mounted a simulated down attack on Oahu, taking them completely by surprise. The Army was in charge of defending the island, and they did an attack just at dawn, completely surprised the Army defenders and proved that Pearl Harbor could be attacked. Of course, the Japanese were taking notes, as everyone well knows. So how did he improve the landing cycle? Well, they came up with a system. Once an airplane landed, the blue shirts, the sailors in blue jerseys, would push the airplanes or muscle the airplanes forward to the bow of the ship. And then a net would be put up and the next airplane would come in. If it didn't catch an arresting gear wire, it would go into that net that you see there. And this could be quickly erected and taken down. So that if he missed a wire, the pilot coming, if he missed a wire, he'd go into the net, he wouldn't crash into a pack of airplanes that were up forward. They tried different ways of doing this. And, initially they tried we'll move the airplanes forward and hope they catch a wire. Well, they had one pilot come in, he missed all the wires and he rolled right into the airplane pack on the bow and basically took out almost the entire squadron. So they said, well, we better come up with something. So they came up with this collapsible net. Now, this photo that you're seeing is actually an aircraft carrier of 1950s era, but it gives you an idea what I'm talking about that collapsible neck. Once all the aircraft were safely back aboard, they were pushed aft and rearmed and refueled, and recovery time was cut in half. That's how we did increase the landing and takeoff cycle. That's what Reeves is best noted for. So let's talk a bit about these aircraft. There's the Vought VE-7. And that was the hot fighter plane in the early 1920s. The largest post-World War I order was for this airplane, about 128 of these airplanes. This could move along at a scorching 117 miles an hour. Very primitive. And then you had that Aeromarine 39 Bravo that you see there. And that was the airplane that Chevy Chevalier landed on the aircraft carrier for the first landing on the Langley. And then you had the first aircraft designed for aircraft carrier work, which this Vought and Naval Aircraft Factory TS-1. It wasn't a very successful airplane. Performance was lacking. Our Army pilots had a field day with this airplane. They could easily get on its tail and basically in these mock dogfights. And then the Navy came out with the Boeing F-2B, which was a vast improvement with a radial engine, and this could more than hold its own against Army fighters. It was the first true aircraft designed as a fighter plane for aircraft carrier work. So they made a lot of progress in a very short period of time. Here we are, Boeing FB-5. Now that is being restored at the San Diego Air and Space Museum. It's nearly complete, the restoration process. This was also an early Navy fighter built by Boeing Aircraft. Kind of a funny story about this. The first flights were done off the Langley. Actually, 27 of these airplanes were built. They were powered by inline Packard engines. And they were built at the Boeing factory, was near the water's edge up there in Seattle. And what they did is they put them on barges, barged them out to the Langley and hoisted them onto the flight deck, assembled the airplanes. Maiden flights of these airplanes were done right off the Langley's flight deck. That's what they did back in those days. They didn't waste any time. After 2 years of service, the Navy switched to air-cooled engines for shipboard aircraft. That was done to standardize everything. Air-cooled engines were more reliable at the time, less maintenance. The Marine Corps got these FB-5 aircraft. Now, there's only 4 of these left today. One of them is at the Smithsonian. One's at a Marine Corps museum, and then one is at San Diego Air and Space Museum, and I believe the other one's up in Chino. All right, loss of a lady. So after 5 years as the nation's only aircraft carrier, Langley was joined by faster, more capable ships like the Lexington and Saratoga in 1927. She greatly influenced the design and construction of these ships, and also the techniques and tactics, trained the initial cadre of aviators and flight deck crew members. Now, flight deck crew members, very important individuals, because they can get these airplanes, if they're trained properly, they can get them launched and recovered minimum time. So by 1936, Langley was kind of old news. She's very slow. She had proved her worth as an experiment. And the Navy decided to convert her to a seaplane tender by removing the forward portion of her flight deck. You can see that right here. First, she served in the Atlantic, and then she went over to the Pacific. And when World War II broke out, the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. Langley was operating off in the Philippines off Manila. And the war broke out, and she initially dodged the Japanese onslaught. She got to Darwin, Australia in January 1942, where she supported Australian anti-submarine patrols being flown out of Darwin. And things were going badly for the Allies initially in World War II. The Japanese were steamrolling right down, through the Philippines, Singapore, everything else. And they were in the process of attacking Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. So the Allies were desperate to hold on to Java, the island of Java, and they needed warplanes. So Langley was tasked to deliver these U.S. Army fighters, these P-40 Warhawk fighters, to a port in Dutch East Indies called Chilat Chap. So they loaded 32 of these Army P-40 Warhawks onto the flight deck and set sail with a destroyer escort to the island of Java to try to deliver these warplanes. Now, I might add that they had 32 Army pilots aboard, 12 Army mechanics, and very few of these pilots had any experience flying P-40s. Didn't matter. That's how desperate they were to get these airplanes out there. She never made it. Reconnaissance airplane found that little flotilla. Next thing you know, a squadron of Japanese bombers and fighters shows up. They start attacking the Langley. Langley's skipper did a great job of avoiding the first salvos of bombs. It rained down from the sky. They had very little protection. They had light machine guns, basically trying to defend themselves. They were maneuvering. The skipper did a great job maneuvering, avoiding the bombs, but then the Japanese squadron commander basically did a grid attack where he dropped bombs in all quadrants. That wherever the Langley turned, she was going to run into bombs, and that's exactly what happened on the third attack. She took 5 direct hits. Her decks were ablaze. The airplanes were on fire. They were trying to push the airplanes over the side. The Zeros came down, started strafing the decks. They still fought on. The skipper made a gallant attempt to reach the port in Java, but once the engine room flooded, that was it. Propulsion was lost. He gave the order to abandon ship. The escorting destroyers sank or scuttled her with gunfire and torpedoes. So you can see Langley taking a torpedo hit here by one of the escorting destroyers. They didn't want her to be captured by the Japanese. The sailors that you see in the foreground, that's part of the Langley's crew that watching the ship being torpedoed going down. Might add that most of these sailors did not survive the war because they were transferred to a tanker called the Picos and destroyers. And a few days later, those vessels themselves were sunk by the Japanese. First Lady of Naval Aviation, with a call of pilots, man your planes, first boomed out across her decks a century ago, rests today beneath the Java Sea. However, a legacy endures aboard the massive nuclear-powered aircraft carriers that sail with America's fleet today. There we go. Joe R. Ford, very latest and greatest. Pilots, man your plane. Cat says we're done.